is what it is. Hello, Dan.
Hello.
We're back.
I'm
doing all right. I'm doing all right. I think we briefly, for the royal listener, Dan and I briefly spoke right before this about, should we talk about Iran? should we have that talk? Do we have anything that's worthwhile to add in? Probably not, other than just to say, I think I've had a very interesting experience in terms, because I asked you what your apocalypse meter's at, and we were both just like, I don't know, dude. And I think
I'm suspicious that my apocalypse meter is not working as it should be.
It's broken. The doomsday clock is broken.
I think it's just not getting the right signal from it.
There's like a third axis that needed to be added to the doomsday clock for it to work, and it is just not there. Yeah. I think I need
to wind my apocalypse meter, but at the moment I'm choosing not. I'm choosing not to. I'm being a coward and choosing not to do the basic maintenance on my apocalypse meter. It's gathering dust.
I haven't seen many of those. Who are the scientists that do the doomsday clock? I haven't seen much of them recently.
I thought that was so. Yeah.
It was in Watchmen.
The Watchmen comic.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that both of our only reference for it?
I assumed it was a thing. I thought it was.
And then your assumption is that it's a real thing because it's in an Alan Moore comic.
Well, it's in a comic.
Alan Moore wouldn't lie to you.
yeah, exactly. You can beam monstrous alien creatures into New York City, and it'll solve everything. It's fine. I think my apocalypse clock is just like, I'm so used to everything just being like, here's the apocalypse, and then it's just kind of like fizzles out in the most absurd, horrifying way possible. I think I realized that my apocalypse clock might just be tied directly to this is grim, to Israel, because it's like the reporting that's come out right now about Iran as of Wednesday when we're recording this seems to basically just be that Israel called up the Trump administration and was like, hey, we're attacking Iran in like 24 hours. You need to join.
Be there or be square.
Yeah, be there or be square. Trump was like, I don't want to be square. and I don't know, man. It seems like, Jesus, if that's actually how it played out, I feel like we're just kind of waiting for everything to collapse in Israel and that to end really badly. You know what I mean? Because it's like, if they're just willing to just keep having enemies and keep starting these wars, because otherwise, if they stop, their entire economy will crumble. Like, I don't know, it's pretty grim. Also kind of funny, my last thought on that, also kind of funny that John Bolton is like not part of the one administration that finally gets to attack Iran, and that he was like fired from the first administration because he was too gung-ho on wanting to attack Iran. I'd be like, man, what the fuck if I was him? But whatever. Yeah.
Well, what was the name? Did they fall out, him and Trump? Is this just a fuck you to John Bolton? Is that what
yeah, he's like, you know what? Now we're going to do it. That would be very Trumpian to be like, that's the only reason he's attacked Iran.
I mean, that's the only motivation that he has, right? It's like,
personal vendettas.
Personal grievance. Hey.
Very grim.
Hey. Well, on the plus side, I think spring may have sprung yesterday.
I think it has.
I've seen a little bit of sunshine, which has reminded me what it's meant to feel like to be a human being.
Sunshine, daffodils are up. Yeah, it's spring.
Yeah.
America started another war.
Imagine a very sort of Fallout-esque scene where I sort of skip through some flowers as the nukes fall or something.
Yeah, exactly. No more nerd references for this episode, Dan.
Okay, yes.
We need everyone to think we're cool.
I think we lost them a long time ago.
Also, last thing on that too, you made a very good point. How strange it is to have one of these wars start, which I kind of just feel like is just going to kind of be a perpetual like air war where, I don't know, maybe it's the best case scenario where not much more really happens. It's very hard to say, but it is very weird having one of these things happen where it's just like, there wasn't even an attempt to try and make people like support it.
There's no effort to build consent at all.
Yeah.
Which in some ways I wonder whether it actually limits the ability, how far they can go. Like as you say, like maybe you need months and months and months of drumming up popular fervor against your perceived belligerent country before you deploy ground troops or whatever. The ability to get people to buy into this conflict might be limited by how it's just been sprung on everybody, kind of thing.
Or the ruling classes just realize they don't need anybody.
Maybe they don't need to.
Yeah. I like the immediate liberal response that I heard from a number of people was like, oh, so I guess you just don't need Congress's approval to go to war anymore. I was like, what? I was like, what universe are we living in? When have you needed that since, like, I don't know, like World War II? Like, what are you going to do?
Yeah, I mean, we're living in a post-Bush era, right? I'm not sure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. Well, bummer. Real bummer. It's just like, and it's one of those things where it's like, if you're a Marxist, you're just going to sound like an asshole. You know what I mean? Because it's like, I don't know. Unless you're one of the real asshole Marxists who's like, critical support for the regime of like the Islamic Republic, which is like, okay. Yes.
Yeah, what do we want? Regime change with Trumpian characteristics.
Yeah. How will that affect unequal exchange? Have you considered?
Yeah, I have been trying to put this into Marxist terms. It's like, I mean, the only two Marxist, like Marxist touchstones I have for this are like, is it a sort of imperialist war, or is it like an inter-imperialist war?
Yeah.
It's been interesting to read this book in the context of it's been added some present day context to some of the questions raised in our reading this week.
Yeah, absolutely. What did we read, Dan?
What did we read? We read. Shall I tell them?
Go on.
Or should we just carry on?
Now let's just let them figure they read the title. Fuck
we read The Proletarian Revolution and the Renegade Kautsky by Comrade Lenin, which you sort of you trailed a few weeks ago, I think. So.
Yeah, soft launch.
Well, I've taken it nobody by surprise. Which I thoroughly enjoyed, and I like. I mean, we read the State and Revolution some time ago now. I can't remember when exactly that was. In some ways, I suppose that's a follow-up to this, but this is a follow-up to that. But I feel like that's the theoretical text, and this is just the polemic. This is just the how many mean things can I say about Karl Kautsky book. But it was good. It was good.
It was good. And honestly, I don't know. We read the Satan Revolution and we were like, we kind of came away from it. We were like, oh, I don't know about this one, Chief. Because there is a point in that text where it kind of just falls off and it's like, oh, Lenin, what are you talking about, dog? I don't know, man. A lot of stuff and it's good, but then he starts talking about the state and it's like, okay, this honestly, this kind of made me think a bit better of Lenin. And maybe we can get into why that is. There are some things here where it's like, it is what I said a few weeks ago where I was like, it's two liberals fighting. I don't want to oversell that too much. There are some points in this where it's like, okay, guys, whatever. But I did enjoy this as well. And I think part of that is because you can kind of read this in two ways. One of them, which is useful, which is like, how is this applicable to questions now? But then I feel like there's the more interesting way to read it where you're like, this is a, justification. It's a historical document for a person who's caught up in like this major world historic event, trying to justify events that are kind of out of control, or they're spiraling out of control, I should say, as he's caught up in them in, like the great proletarian revolution. And in that context, it's fascinating. It's just so interesting seeing him like polemicize with Kautsky. And, this is written like not too long after the actual events of 1917. And it's just like, this was 1918. And it's just like, yeah, putting it in that context and seeing what Lenin was thinking, it's really fascinating. Whether you wind up agreeing with anything he says or not, it's just an interesting text because it's like, here he is talking about the Constituent Assembly and why it needed to go. Here he is talking about the Constitution, and he starts talking about the kulaks, and it's like, oh God. but yeah, it's interesting if nothing else.
Yeah, it's funny. Maybe I should clarify first. Like to say this isn't a theoretical text isn't to say that it isn't theoretically interesting, right? There's a huge amount of theory in this. There's a huge amount of application of theory to practice. So I found it really rewarding in that respect, and sort of like found it provoking when it comes to working out, what is a proletarian revolution, what is the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then, as you say, like one can read it with an eye to, okay, what can you extract from this to a present day context, or to just like a historical theoretical understanding of a revolutionary transformation to socialism. But I think I was just like, I was so caught up in it that I didn't really read it in that context that you've just said of like Lenin justifying actions as they happen, maybe even justifying theoretically things that have happened just out of pure historical contingency or happenstance or whatever. But yeah, I was definitely aware of the fact that like here is Lenin defending things which I suppose liberal historians of the Russian Revolution would certainly condemn, and things even when I've read histories of the Russian Revolution, I sort of questioned, as you say, the sort of like the decision to dissolve the Constitutional Assembly at the end of I don't know when that was, early 1918. It's given a sort of like defense predicated on Marxist theory. So yeah, interesting to read a fun juxtaposition of something which is very historically specific, but then also theoretical at the same time.
Yeah, and I think it did do away with a lot of my kind of like, whenever you ask anyone about the Russian Revolution, they have to have a take, and I think this really goes a long way to eschewing a lot of single takes, because it's like, I don't know. I'm obviously not going to defend a lot of the things regarding the peasants in here, but there is also like a very interesting question that is posed about like, well, here's what happened. You know what I mean? Here's the circumstances we were given. Were we not going to step in and take power? Yada, yada, yada. We'll get to all of that. I think we should just start at the beginning, which is the question that runs through all of this is about the dictatorship of the proletariat. And Kautsky in 1918 was very critical of the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution, seemed to kind of side at that point with a lot more of the like kind of Menshevik ideas about how the revolution should have gone. And the question that's posed at the beginning is, how does democracy relate to a revolution? And Kautsky has this very kind of like overarching kind of like abstract idea about the majority versus the minority, meaning the proletariat versus the exploiters, and specifically about like what Lenin calls democracy in general, right? Kautsky kind of has this idea about like, well, you kind of just need to leave things up to the majority of people. You need to have democracy be your guiding light, and you just need to let that be how revolutions play out, and however they play out is how they're going to play out. Lenin's idea is a lot different, because he's kind of saying there's no such thing as democracy in general. You can't abstract away from the society that you're living within to just say democracy is the fairest thing, because he's like, when is it ever fair to like exploit people? You know what I mean? And he gets into a lot of other things about like, you can say democracy is great all you want, even if you've had a successful revolution, but while there's still like an ounce of possibility of exploiters getting their ability to exploit back, they're going to try and fight tooth and nail and kill as many people as possible to get that back. So it's like, at what point does democracy really matter then? And yeah, it's just the first section, which is called something like how Kautsky's turned into a common liberal or something like that, is very, it's very, very good. And this is just the central question about it, right? It's like, is there such a thing as democracy in general versus how do you actually apply democracy to a class society, and especially a class society that's in rupture like this, where it's like cards are just on the table. Bourgeoisie is just like, we're just going to kill people if we don't get our way. Lenin's like, you kind of have to break a few eggs. By break a few eggs, I don't mean like, slaughter the ruling class. What he's saying is like, political machinations around well, a dictatorship of the proletariat, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, what's that first chapter? How Kautsky turned Marx into an everyday liberal or something.
Banger.
I guess I have to say that from the off that I feel like my everyday liberalism was challenged by this to pieces as well in a lot of respects. I mean, it's as somebody raised on like bourgeois political science, and but yes, that that confession aside, I think the crux of like what Kautsky is trying to do, as portrayed by Lenin in this piece, is that he's attempting to downgrade or completely deceive his readers as to what Marx and Engels meant by the dictatorship of the proletariat. He's trying to make it a very much trying to downplay Marx's use of the word dictatorship, very much trying to make it a kind of abstract characteristic rather than something that has like concrete real world applications. Lenin proceeds to quote from Marx and Engels extensively about the many places in which they talk about this idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, or recognize in the conditions of some kind of proletarian revolution, where one class is pitched against another, there's going to have to be some kind of political conflict. The recognition by Marx and Engels is to say that states are purely apparatuses of one class oppressing another, apparatuses of one ruling class oppressing another. And I suppose by extension of that, the characteristics of a state are defined by the characteristics of the mode of production and what kind of relationships have to be put in place to allow that mode of production to exist. But also they're recognizing the political necessity, potentially in a revolutionary situation, of one class actively suppressing the other's ability to continue to act as exploiting ruling class. And that might take means which are offensive to sort of everyday liberal thinkers who have this understanding of politics where it's sort of pluralistic. It doesn't recognize, the most important thing is it just doesn't recognize the existence of class. It doesn't recognize the sort of like economic and political necessity of one class exploited by another. So that's what Kautsky is seemingly removing from Marx and Engels' political analysis, and what Lenin is trying to put firmly back in the frame, I suppose, as justification for his particular efforts to institute if not the dictatorship of the proletariat, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in a society that is based on exploitation and violence, it shouldn't come as a massive surprise that to get rid of that, you do have to suppress the ability of the people engaging in the act of exploiting others to engage in politics, right? Like, I don't know. This is all, the thing is when you get into questions like this, it can be all very subjective, because you would want to say that it's quite cut and dry in a revolutionary situation, who's who and what they want and all this different stuff. But it's like, it's never going to be that. So there's always going to be an amount of like political disagreement over the extent to which you suppress the ruling class's right to like exert itself politically. And Lenin has a really interesting point in this, where he says the dissolving of the Constituent Assembly is actually really interesting, and there is a debate to be had there about what should have been done. He's like, I'm of the mind that we should just dissolve the Constituent Assembly. That's kind of why we did it. But he makes a really interesting point where he is like, this is the moment where the rubber meets the road, where you're like, what are we doing here? Are we actually trying to build a socialist society? Because if we are, get rid of these like liberals who are trying to like bring us back to Kerensky's government. You know what I mean? And it's like, you want to just be like, fair enough, because if you're trying to do a socialist revolution, there are going to be moments where you need to do that. But Lenin quite rightly does point out that this is kind of like, well, maybe he doesn't point this out, but he hints at this being like, well, it's a political decision. So it's always going to be subjective to a certain extent. So when you are talking about something concretely like dissolving the Constituent Assembly, people are going to have different views on it, many of whom are socialists, right? It's like, he calls it like a very interesting concrete situation where the reality of like revolution becomes, well, concrete, I guess, you know.
I mean, this is one of the critiques that he makes of Kautsky, is that Kautsky should have just written a book that says like why I disagree with what the Bolsheviks are doing in Russia. You know, like at least then he'd be arguing on the grounds of sort of concrete historical and political circumstances, rather than pretending to have some kind of like theoretical basis for what he's arguing for. I mean, I think that one of the most interesting thing I thought in this piece that crops up multiple times in different contexts is Lenin's effort to remind his readers that what's important is the particular historical and political context of what's happening, to differentiate between sort of like theoretically a pure understanding of a theory, purely in terms of the theory, and then the sort of the messiness of and the application of something in a historical setting. So one of the things that Kautsky seems to be taking great issue with, particularly in the context, or maybe the primary example of this, is the dissolving of the Constituents Assembly, which I understand to be like a sort of like a traditional parliamentary election that happened toward the end of 1917 or at the beginning of 1918. I can't remember when exactly the elections happened, right? So the elections might have happened before the October Revolution, but then the assembly met for the first time afterwards. Kautsky is taking issue with the removal of the franchise, removal of the right to have a political expression, I suppose, from Kautsky's perspective, the removal of the franchise is from a certain subset of the population, you know, without consideration for class, perhaps. Whereas Lenin would say, well, no, we're removing the franchise from particular people who are intent on hampering our efforts at revolution, who will attempt to protect their class interest. But one of the things Lenin says is this is a particular instance of an effort at the sort of like transformation of a state into a proletarian state, in a particular example of the institution of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which in this particular setting in Russia necessitates, from his standpoint, coming back to what you were just saying, you know, Lenin thinks historically the moment necessitates this particular type of political repression of the revolution's class enemies. But he doesn't say that like this is how all political revolutionary transformations will take place. Just that in this particular instance, that's what's happening. In relation to that, also, like it's he also, I quite like the way he talks about particular examples of the dictatorship of the proletariat rather than the pure example of what that means. He's not particularly interested in some pure concept of what the dictatorship of the proletariat is. And he frequently talks about the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, as being a particular example. Well, what he's actually talking about is the Soviet state, right? The Soviet form of he talks about the Soviet form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. He also talks about the commune, like the Paris Commune form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So it's interesting to be reminded of that fact that, like, here is a theoretical idea, but it has sort of historical examples of its emergence and extantiation, I suppose.
Yeah, I was actually really pleasantly surprised to see that in here, right? Where he doesn't come out and say everybody needs to do the Soviet model. He's just immediately like, look, I know Russia's backwards and this is how we had to do it, right? I thought there was something to that, because I did just expect him to be like, and here's why Germany needs to do this too. Yeah, it's all very, very interesting. I mean, you know, I think the issues that I have with this are probably when he starts talking about, he tries to give that pure definition of what a state is, and not kind of meld something like a definition of the state with what it is that the Bolsheviks are actively trying to do concretely in in, what was becoming the Soviet Union, like he just comes out explicitly here and says that all states are just, elements, or they're just, all they are is instruments for one class to oppress another, right? He's like, that's what a state is. And it's like, oh man, like that has cropped up so many times over the last 100 years, where people just having that as their definition for really shitty, bad socialist politics. And I think this is one of the main issues that at least I had with the state revolution, where it's like, no, Lenin, that isn't necessarily how you want to be thinking about states going into a proletarian revolution. But at the same time, it's also they had to do something. They, I don't know. I don't want to be somebody that's just well, the material circumstances necessitated all of the fucking horrors that the Bolsheviks wound up doing. But it's like I said at the beginning, it's very easy to just have a take on the revolution. And I think you can pretty, if you want to have a take, just say that the understanding of communism, I think, just wasn't necessarily there at its base, social relations, what this was, let alone how you would plan an economy if you wanted to do a centrally planned economy, which also can't work. Kind of wild that nobody was thinking about those two things. They seem like two very big things that the Bolsheviks should have been thinking about. But at the end of, I don't know, I don't really know what I'm trying to say here, other than just you can see where Lenin is coming from in this specific historic moment, because you can see how quickly things are changing and how dynamic the situation is. And what I will say is, for Lenin to have the foresight, maybe, or the kind of sense of, what's the peace of mind, something of mind, where to basically say what we're doing here is specific to Russia because of our material circumstances, is quite commendable. Even if I completely disagree with how he defines what a state is, it is quite commendable for him to be we're not expecting everybody to do it like this. We're doing it like this because of the fucking chaos that is in Russia at the moment, right? You are going to have to make subjective political decisions, I guess I should just say, about, what an enemy of the revolution is. And at the end of the day, if Marxism teaches us anything, it's that from a certain level of abstraction, you can tell who in broad groups are exploiters and who are the exploited. It's much more complicated now, I would say, but I don't know. All I'm trying to say, I guess, pretty complicated back then. And you get from especially these first few chapters, you do get a sense of Lenin in the mix of it, not as Lenin, this abstract concept. It was here's Lenin being forced to make these decisions along with all the other Bolsheviks. And yeah. Would have been interesting if they just stopped. It's what would have happened? Russia just would have fucking collapsed. You know what I mean? More than it did, right? If it's I don't know, okay, we forfeit the Civil War. What then? I don't know.
Okay, I mean, I'm glad that you re-raised those critiques of Lenin in State and Revolution, right? Or might be worth also bringing into the context the group of international communists' critique of the monetary policy adopted by the Bolsheviks quite quickly after the Russian Revolution, and the effort to kind of inflate away money and the sort of catastrophic consequences you can imagine that would have. But I also feel like it's worth. My inclination is also to perhaps try and give the traditional defense and sort of to jump to the end of this book, I suppose. And to say how this book ends, which is without a conclusion, because Lenin's just oh yeah, I hear that maybe there's just been a revolution in Germany, so just going to stop writing now because what am I going to but it's interesting to put it in that context, because as I was reading this, it was here's the revolution, its high point almost. Here's the kind of the promise of the potential trajectory that we're going to take. Sure, we can have the critique which says you don't have a particularly good understanding of what the social relations of communism are going to be and what kind of economic policies you might need to transition, what do you need to get rid of immediately. But this is still the time when the promise of communist revolution across Western Europe continue to be the kind of guiding star of this, where it's the, I don't know, it's the Deus ex machina of communism, where it's just like that's the thing that will solve all the problems. That's the MacGuffin, we'll just like aim at revolution in the rest of Europe. But so I don't know. One of the ways in which I was appreciating reading this book was as the sort of high watermark of the revolution in Russia. Sad to read it in that context as well, but I don't know.
Yeah, that was so tragic. I had to reread those last sentences a few times to be like, was he really writing this on the night that he was getting news? That, like,
it could be dramatic license, couldn't it? It could be.
Yeah, I know. He was like, we'll all show Kautsky. Now there's a revolution in Germany. It's just like, oh, fuck. Oh, my God.
I'm glad he didn't put the whole text in the bin, because that would have been
yeah. He's like, well, this was useless. Also, there's one point here, and he's like, as I said in my letter to the workers of America, I was just like, oh man, how times have changed. Oh my God. All right, so maybe moving on a little bit. There's some stuff in here about revolutionary defeatism, and there's some stuff in here about the army. And this is kind of, we were talking about this right before we started recording, the bit about the army stuff, because Lenin just very casually says at one point here, he's like, no revolution has ever succeeded and no revolution will ever succeed until the army is like organically dissolved and the, just foot soldiers stand alongside like the barricades or whatever with like the workers. And I hope he's wrong about that one. I really fucking hope he's wrong about that one, because like, trying to imagine something like that happening now, I suppose, especially with like police who are so like, in an increasingly zero growth environment, there are some of the few quote unquote workers, quote unquote, who have a like pretty good deal and their unions are like really respected and are probably like the strongest fucking unions, at least in America, right? Like, and they're also like armed like a military and all of this shit, and just ideologically, obviously, not about to stand on the barricades, I think, anytime soon. But I think it also raises a really good point, right? Where it's like, so much of like revolutionary talk now and always has always been a very like, I'll try and sound smart here, Clausewitzian view of like war and of conflict, right? Where it's like a big force meets smaller force, big force wins. And that's how it always works. But it's like, realistically, given the repressive structures we're up against, and even that they were up against then, I think this is kind of Lenin's point, is like none of it's ever going to succeed unless those bands are that the things that the ties that bind all of those different repressive apparatuses together are dissolved out of necessity, and it's not a matter of like a revolutionary people's army defeating like the LAPD, right? It's more of a matter of like, if you wanted to have like more of a councilist view, it would be like the production relations are slowly organically changing, so that you just lose a need for something like this. Realistically, I think in a revolutionary situation, it would just be like paychecks stop coming in and there's no need for people to do this, right? For people to continue to repress. How realistic that is, I don't know. I suppose all I'm trying to say is like, Lenin's point, as utopian as it might seem, I think probably is a necessity, where it's like, until, whether it's an ideological thing, whether it's like a material circumstances thing, until these repressive apparatuses are disbanded organically, then you're probably not going to succeed, because it's not going to be a matter of just defeating them outright, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess it depends on how deeply ingrained in society a sort of like a socialist or communist organization or group of socialist and communist organizations have been able to instill these ideas, right? Like you're never going to have substantial enough members of the army or the police identify with socialism when you don't even have a substantial population group of people within the general population that subscribe to these ideas. I think it's probably quite essential that you raise the idea of like a revolutionary situation, and we should compare that to a non-revolutionary situation, I suppose. Like there's an extent to which this book is written very much in the midst of a revolutionary moment, and so some of the context for how he's speaking about repressing political opponents or like using revolutionary violence to meet those ends are very specific to a revolutionary moment. It isn't. I feel like the prescription should not be, okay, we need to go out and, I don't know, like form revolutionary combat units or something to prepare for the day when we need to put down the bourgeoisie. You know, like that's not the argument that's being made. I mean, there's a follow-up conversation we could have about, like, okay, how do you prepare for the dictatorship of the proletariat? How do you conceive of the dictatorship of the proletariat as a programmatic strategy of a revolutionary party in non-revolutionary times, I suppose. And I do I feel like it's an interesting idea to think about sort of program for communists with the idea of the sort of dictatorship of the proletariat as a sort of guiding understanding of how the transition to socialism will have to happen and what kind of reckoning with the state will that entail. We're very much not in the revolutionary context that Lenin is writing from or writing for. I don't know. We might not be the audience of the Renegade Kautsky piece.
Yeah. 100 years later in a completely different context. I suppose too. I shouldn't be as flippant about the cops too. Well, be as flippant as you want, I guess. But it's worth noticing that I think in the Russian Revolution, two things happened in terms of, a lot of things happened, but two things I'll mention here in terms of like their repressive apparatuses. One was just World War I was going so disastrously for the Russian army that it lost its ability to like not even just pay people to like continue to have them survive on the front lines, not just from like, German like artillery just like shredding them all to pieces, but just like they were cold and they didn't have boots. So people were just like, I'm just going to go back to my fucking farm. Like if I can make it and if my officer's going to stop me, fuck them. You know what I mean? But then there's also like back then it would probably have, prior to the revolution, it probably would have been pretty inconceivable that like any of the Cossack like police units ever would have like sided with the like revolutionary proletariat because they had just been killing them, right? Whenever they took them to the streets up until they stopped doing that, large parts of them, I guess. Right. So it's like for those people then they probably could never have imagined a scenario where that specific like armed wing of the state like stood with the people, and eventually a lot of them did. So who knows? I guess like it always just gets me back. Like every time you ever read any historical primary source, like the day before revolution happens, everyone's just like, going to bed, and there will be no revolution tomorrow. It's just like, and then everything massively changed.
One of the things that I did quite enjoy about this was the Lenin's effort to describe and defend Soviet form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, particularly in the context of Russia, right? Like, I don't know how thoroughly I understood the case that was being made, but he's sort of like attempting to argue against Kautsky that dissolving the Constitutive Assembly was like a curtailing of democracy. I suppose in some respects it was a curtailing of bourgeois democracy, but he's trying to make the case for the sort of the Soviet form of government being presenting a sort of purer form of democracy, or a form of democracy more appropriate to a state in the transition to socialism, more appropriate to a state that's attempting to empower the working class to rule. And I just sort of found it quite interesting. Like, I mean, maybe it's just, a sort of post hoc justification, but like attempting to just sort of like champion the Soviet form as simply what I was just saying, as an effort to put the proletariat in a position of being able to rule, to make them administrators of society. Something that I've been thinking of, well, as I was reading through this, it's like, what's the distinction between like a bourgeois democracy and some kind of hypothetical proletarian democracy? what is the example of the dictatorship of the proletariat that's represented by this historical case, what Lenin calls like the Soviet form, and sort of this effort to empower workers, or an effort to merge the kind of like political administration of society with a new form of economic administration of society. Just it was just a fun. I enjoyed that description of the process, and it got me thinking about is it a matter of sort of like combining the economic and the political, taking the people who do the work of reproducing society and put them in the position of also being able to administer that society. I don't know how effective the sort of like Soviet form of government in these early stages of the revolution was, but that theoretical justification for it, I found very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always just come back to the idea. It's just like, as empty as this sounds, it's like, unless you can actually come up with a way to fundamentally change the social relations of production, it kind of doesn't really matter if you have a like Soviet form of democracy or a bourgeois form of democracy, because like at the end of the day, if that hasn't changed, like it is very easy to just be like, and the state is an epiphenomena of the underlying social relations. And so if those don't change, then nothing's ever going to change. And you can't do it the other way around. But I think what this text shows us is that there are moments in history where groups like the Bolsheviks and like the workers in like Petrograd and places like that are placed in these situations where it's like, okay, make some decisions about how things are going to go. And those are political decisions. And like, there's even parts of this in the fundamental principles where it seems like they're talking about political decisions being made to institute the system of accounting that is like labor time accounting, and about like foisting that on other workers who are like, we want to keep using money. They're like, no, you're not going to keep using money. You're going to fucking get paid like this, And it's like, I don't know. I'm trying to avoid just giving the kind of like basic, well, they didn't change the underlying production relations of society, because to make a binary distinction like that in a revolutionary moment between the political and the economic, I think is kind of missing the point. Because like I said at the beginning, this is very much a historical text of an extremely pivotal world historic moment, and seeing how those decisions are navigated, like, it's very interesting. I'm not trying to justify how Lenin went about it, because I think the main disaster of the Bolsheviks is that like they didn't know what communism was and they didn't know what economic planning was, two big flags. But like, this text has showed me, because of like the position that the Bolsheviks were in, that it's like, it is not as cut and dry as just like, well, why didn't you just change the social relations? It's like, that is a political process in and of itself. And unless you have a like idealized, perfect councilist revolution, which, hey, maybe one day, where just all of a sudden all of the proletariat come together and just go, what about if we just kind of organized ourselves, along the lines of like labor time accounting, and made it so that like, all firms are communally reproduced, directly social labor, all of that stuff. In that scenario, you could just do without a state, right? But it's like, these, again, like bringing that about in anything other than like a perfectly idealized snap 1 second capitalism, 1 second communism moment, which is probably not really possible. Like, it's going to be a political decision how you go about trying to do that. And you're going to be balancing like, pissing off this group of people, alienating that group of people, trying to bring these people in to get this thing passed. And like, yeah. And in the context of a civil war, the most violent civil war ever, was, well, up until that point, tricky. All I'm going to say, tricky.
One of the things I was just thinking about was like, changing the subject a little bit. One of the things I was thinking about was my everyday liberalism, and something that I was trying to extract from this text, and it's in there at some points, and this is almost more of a theoretical thing removed from the historical context, is attempting to create a communist critique of bourgeois society, almost a communist critique of democratic bourgeois representative government. yeah, yeah. I appreciated Lenin's efforts to do that, but it's something that I also want to work on theoretically, because like is a sort of quite a substantive challenge to. I mean, we live in increasingly non-functional bourgeois democracies, right? Like it's becoming quite evident. The or it's being revealed the willingness of leaders of some countries to use increasingly authoritarian means, particularly in the context of like some hypothetical continuing economic decline, with greater degrees of social resistance um, or what have you. We don't know what kind of repressive means will be put. Lenin lists off a whole load of different examples of supposedly bourgeois democratic governments repressing minorities. I mean, the most pertinent one in this context is just the reaction to striking workers and how state and military apparatuses are used to put down, strikes and the like, or to, enforce racial segregation or imperial rule in the case of Northern Ireland or what have you, or Ireland, I suppose, in the context of when this was written. But I do feel like it's important to, and something that I want to work on is sort of like work out a critique of bourgeois democracies that is potentially appealing to people or potentially sort of like comprehensible to everyday, citizens of the United States or Great Britain who have sort of been raised on this idea of we live in the top tier of free societies, and then like the extension of that more theoretical question is like, well, all of these things that we consider to be political democratic norms that are lauded by liberal defenders of Western democracy, can one simply draw a line between those and what is necessary to run a capitalist society, right? Like, do you need to have some kind of conception of equal rights, sort of like democratic freedoms to be able to also operate a sort of like an economic system similarly predicated on freedom and equality in the face of the law or in the face of the market? So yeah, I want to. I feel like my liberal admission is not having fully worked out a convincing communist critique of bourgeois society, I suppose. Lenin's making good inroads into my liberal brain in this book, so I enjoyed that. But yeah,
he's not there yet. We'll read Kautsky's response.
Oh yeah,
to this,
yeah. Maybe.
We'll be like,
I'm sure. I'll be fully liberal pilled. I'm not making some great concession to being a liberal here, other than my ongoing reckoning with my those tendencies that are within me.
yeah. I mean, yeah, I absolutely see what you're saying. The thing is, though, is that like the communist critique, capital T, capital C, of bourgeois democracy is the underlying system of production that undergirds it all, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like, how do you make that critique to people when that's just like so obscured these days? Especially if you're living in a place like, Europe or the United States or something, like the imperial core, it's like really not obvious to people, commodity fetishism. It's a real thing. It's really not obvious to people that like production relations determine why my like, I don't know, like delivery driver job, like, is so shitty, and why, Trump will do all of these horrible things and the Democrats will just be like, yeah, sure, whatever, that's fine, and just continue to also do all of those horrible things. Like that at the end of the day is the critique you're looking for. It's just not the one that's helping you in the way I think that you want it to, because it's like, yeah. What's funny is I recently I went back and read some cosmonaut stuff. When we interviewed, what's his name, Cliff, on the piece that he wrote, I read that, and then there was another piece on, it was like a 12-step guide for the DSA or something like that. Like it was like, how to get rid of the attachment to the Democrats or whatever. And it was, it was a lot of the stuff about like, we need a new constitution and whatever, which is like, I don't want to critique on the grounds that it's like not possible, because it's like, well, we're socialists, right? Like, come on, like if I threw that critique at him on everything, like give me a break,
We're in the business of demanding the impossible.
Well, I mean, right up until it is the only thing that will work, right? Like, exactly. But I don't know. I think I was just kind of trying to like find some people who are trying to do something like what you're trying to say, right? Which is like make a more democratic society appealing to people, because it increasingly is just not, it seems like, in the imperial core, right? Like, and I don't know. I don't have much to say about it other than it's just interesting, like the ways in which you kind of have to not meet people halfway. You almost have to meet like states halfway. And that's just kind of not something I'm super comfortable with, because it's like the critiques, I don't know. It's very difficult. It's like when you're trying to talk about why we need to get rid of the American Constitution, in fact, why we need to like, stop working with the Democrats, like it without that kind of like underlying critique of production, which is so hard to make to people these days. It's a very hard thing to do. It's a very, very hard thing to do, right? Because you wind up having to, at the end of the day, justify it by an exploitation that is just eminently hidden. And, I have no doubt that that's like changing, and that like exploitation is becoming more and more obvious. But, I guess I'm just I don't really know how you make that critique, of like bourgeois democracy, because it seems like people are open to it to a certain extent, and then it always just winds up becoming like, I'm not going to say your party. I'll say something. I'll say Podemos, right? I'll say Syriza or something like that. But like, yeah, I don't know. It's tricky.
I suppose it's a matter of finding sort of like wedge issues, for want of a better phrase, like something like concrete that people can understand that draws attention to a sort of broader deficit or example of the more underlying class relations of capitalism and the exploitation that goes on there. I guess one of the other things that I struggle with is something that you alluded to earlier, is like it's all good and well saying that the dictatorship of the proletariat is using a state to do the thing which states are designed to do, which is like repress the interests of one class in favor of another one. But then, I mean, Lenin does it in multiple points in this, get into the minutiae of kind of like, well, how are we identifying one class versus another? And there's a sort of degree of abstracting away from sort of like pure class characteristics into using terminology like employers versus like wage workers, or I can't remember, there's even more sort of obscure language about this sort of dispossessed or what have you. And obviously, like in the context of the Russian Revolution, they're in sort of general alliance with the peasantry, and then have to decide, well, who are peasants that are in favor of the Russian Revolution or sort of a socialist revolution, and who are the middle class peasants. He has some particularly unfavorable things to say about the middle class in this. Like he's almost like rejecting the entire strata, whereas like, I don't know, that would be pretty suicidal in a non-revolutionary, politically suicidal in a non-revolutionary situation, to completely discount how the middle class or people with particular proximity to being a bourgeois are negatively affected by capitalist class and social relations as well. So it just opens another kind of words of the necessity of doing some sort of class analysis when it comes to designing a political strategy. But then, of course, we can just revert back to Lenin isn't making broad proclamations about all historical situations, only the one that he's inhabiting and the political choices that are being made there, and an argument for the necessity of those. So, we'll just have to wait and see what revolutionary situations we find ourselves in. But
yeah, and kind of nice the peasant situation isn't really going to pop up. Unless I guess it is kind of in like a different way, but it's like, I don't know. Mm-hmm. What will the Midwestern American petty bourgeois farmers think of this? He had a really interesting take, actually. And again, really don't want this to come across like I'm justifying what wound up happening to the Russian peasantry, because I'm absolutely not. It was absolutely horrific. I feel like that's such an obvious thing to say. But what I will say is that Lenin's justification in here for what would wind up becoming a disaster was he wanted to avoid being a Blanquist, which is very funny. It's very it's very interesting. It's like, it's like his justification was what we needed to do was treat the peasants as a single totemic class during the revolution. And then now we need to start separating the wheat from the chaff, no pun intended, to like really support the small farmers against the people whose like estates they're trying to break up, right? And the Blanquist thing comes from him saying, if we didn't do that, if we just tried to hold a revolutionary radical line from the very beginning, that would have been like what he calls, like the folly of Blanquism, which you could, I suppose, kind of just say is like utopianism, to think that you could do that, to think that you could. But I mean, they didn't wind up being able to do it. It wound up being a disaster anyway.
Doing, right?
Yeah, I'd say, yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, it was interesting. It showed that type of class analysis that you have to do, that you're talking about, like when you're doing politics, a failure of that. Mm-hmm. But you see, I don't want to say this, you see where he's coming from in the justification he's making in 1918 when a successful revolution is about to happen in Germany, right? Like,
fingers crossed.
Yeah. Really, one last thing, just to go back to kind of what you're talking about the Soviet organization and stuff, and about the specificity of the Russian model. There's a point in this where he quotes Kautsky, and he's trying to be like, look at this idiot. And I was kind of like, Kautsky might be kind of cooking something here. And I just kind of want to read Kautsky's quote here. He says, thus, the Soviet organization is one of the most important phenomena of our time. It promises to acquire decisive importance in the great decisive battles between capital and labor onwards, which we are marching. But are we entitled to demand more of the Soviets? The Bolsheviks, after the Revolution of November, which we now call October 1917, secured in conjunction with the left SRs a majority of the Russian Soviets of workers' deputies, and after the dispersion of the Constituent Assembly, they set out to transform the Soviets from a combat organization of one class, as they had been till then, into a state organization. And then Lenin goes on to basically say the crux of this question is, should the Soviets aspire to become state organizations, or should they not strive for this, refrain from taking power into their own hands, refrain from becoming a state organization, and remain just a combat organization of one class? You can kind of see why Lenin is phrasing it like that, because when you do some kind of like rhetorical trickery there, and you've already defined a state as a thing that suppresses one class at the expense of the other, then you can kind of easily be like, aha, Kautsky, you fool. Yeah, I've talked you into loops. I kind of feel like Kautsky has a point there, though. I don't know how you feel about this, where I kind of feel like that whole section that I read from him, you could just put in like a communizer piece and have it be like, maybe not the same critique, but like a very similar one, where it's like, should we not expect more from the Soviets as like elements of workers' power, as opposed to them just becoming a state? Maybe you do have to kind of like abstract away from this being Kautsky saying this, and like, I don't know, the whole like his whole thing is a state, and it's kind of like him critiquing the idea of a state is kind of funny. This is again why I kind of refer to this as two liberals fighting. But I think that there's some truth to that, to this idea that it's like, well, surely we can expect more from the Soviets, and we should expect more from what we might call like workers' councils or something like that, than just becoming a state and, like doing repression, ... nationalism, ... question mark. I don't think necessarily Kautsky is coming from the best place when he makes that critique, again, because there's like no discussion of production relations in any of this. But he was kind of cooking a little bit there. He's kind of cooking.
Yeah, well, I think if Lenin is to be believed, then Kautsky is making quite a poor faith argument, at least in the sense that what he's actually arguing for is don't use these new representative bodies of the workers to be the basis of the new state, but rather you should have democratic elections and elect a sort of pluralistic bourgeois seeming government and have a bourgeois revolution and keep capitalism in check or intact, or make some kind of social peace with the bourgeoisie. I guess the point you're making is to draw attention to the fact, well, it is possible, and as what did happen, it is possible for some kind of dictatorial regime to usurp the name, the existence of the Soviets, and sort of use them to uphold a sort of like I don't know, like a non-socialist state, or to defend a sort of degrading revolutionary state, in potentially much the same way that, you know, trade unions are used to be the representative of workers under capitalism, and the bodies of the workers' institutions become state institutions. So yeah, maybe you also do need to abolish capitalism, and if you don't successfully abolish capitalism, then good luck using your Soviets in any meaningful way, because, you know, you're still doing capitalism. So maybe that's
and it also, like, Kautsky's point does also fall apart when it's kind of just like, they shouldn't be combat organization, or no, they should be combat organizations, but they shouldn't be combat organizations. It's like, you know, yeah. But
I mean, what is that? But I guess, you make an interesting point there of like, what is the distinction between an organization that fights for revolutionary change within one mode of production, but then when you get to the point of actually transforming the mode of production, those organizations don't have a role to play? I mean, I'm not like,
exactly.
It's making two processes out of one, right? Like the pre-revolutionary and the post-revolutionary have to be linked together in some way.
But I think this is like the issue when we talk about these big theoretical understandings of world historic events, when we're talking about like a polemic between two people, because it's like, remember who these people are. Lenin is the guy who is like, needs to justify what is going on right now, otherwise he's going to go insane. And Kautsky is the guy who like kind of wants to, like, you know, maintain respectability as, for being honest, like a bourgeois politician, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, he needs to like toe the line because he calls himself a socialist. You know, Lenin would say a non-revolutionary socialist, which I think is quite true. He wants to pretend that he's being revolutionary, but he also kind of wants to like maintain the respectability of bourgeois elections, right? So of course he's going to balk at like, we need to, you know, the ongoing fight of capital and labor. I think I was giving him too much credit there, which is kind of why I was like, you need to abstract away from Kautsky saying this. But, you know, like, we need to understand that this is Karl Kautsky talking to Vladimir Lenin, right? Yeah. It's like people whose bread is buttered in one very specific place. You know what I mean? Like,
and I suppose you're right to say that, like, what a version of what you're saying would be that, well, we've put all this emphasis on Lenin's particular social situation, but like Kautsky is also in a particular situation. Maybe it's just both self-serving arguments at the end of the day, you know. Like, we might happen to, like, you know, have more of a predilection toward kindness toward one of those, but I don't know.
Well, do we want to? I mean, ostensibly, before we started recording, we were like, we can use the revolutionary defeatism stuff as a way to kind of like transition from Iran to this text.
I didn't realize that was what we were planning to make. I mean, I was glad to come upon these sections about revolutionary defeatism. There isn't like a full-bodied defense of that in this, I suppose, or perhaps, I mean, I'll be entirely honest, I found the last two chapters of this less clear or less useful or less easy to engage with than the early sections of it. I have, however, been thinking about revolutionary defeatism. I found myself in a conversation about, like, you know, what do we do if we go to war with Russia, and you know, I don't know. I'd found myself trying to construct a revolutionary defeatist argument, or to try and work out, like, you know, all one can do is like hope that there are people on the other side that recognize an alignment or allegiance, a bond of class over a allegiance to a state, I suppose, which seems to be the case that Lenin is making. At the end of this, there is he makes a very powerful point, which is to say, like, we're the most like consistently revolutionary because like we're recognizing the class nature of this war and doing the only appropriate thing, which is to like align ourselves with our class and that class's interests in this circumstance, rather than aligning ourselves with the imperialist power that we happen to live within the boundaries of its state, I suppose. But
yeah, and it's also like, as difficult as that argument is to make when you're in a situation where it's like you and everyone are like being evicted from where you live under threat of like death, or just you're not allowed to leave, like in Palestine, right? And you are just being killed anyways. Like, very hard to make that argument where it's like, well, don't join up with the people who have the guns and the means to fight back. Very difficult argument to make. Yeah. But also politically, like, this is like one thing the Bolsheviks did incredibly well is just like keep saying the same thing, which seems radical until it's not. They had faith that it wouldn't be at a certain point, and what do you know? Yeah. It wasn't. It was what everybody was saying at a certain point, right? Like, yeah, I would say that's one thing that is like, politically, you always have to choose your battles. Revolutionary defeatism, I kind of feel like you kind of have to hold the line on, because it's like, it's so obvious to everybody now. Like what we were talking about, it's like, man, they didn't even fucking try to drum up support for this war. Potentially because Trump was just like, oh, fuck, okay, I guess we are going to war with Iran. But like also, like nobody's in fucking favor of going to war with Iran. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, I don't know. And the people who are, it's like they own, fucking Lockheed, right? So it's like, yeah.
Maybe it's naive. I sort of do imagine that people are far more in contact with their own material circumstances and hardships, and maybe aren't as easily led into sort of like a sort of jingoistic fervor against other countries. But maybe.
Well, especially
in the context of whatever the hell we were in 2026 after, compared to 2003, right? We've had how many economic crises and how long of a period of stagnation, and like how much sort of gross overreach by the capitalist class's most repugnant representatives. But
yeah, and those wars aren't helping any of that.
Yes.
Like they used to for the imperial core, right? They used to help, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, hey, you can have a post-war compromise if you just, if tens of millions of you just go and die in Europe. It's like, we'll let you have unions, right? Like that's not happening anymore. And, just to say nothing of like the technologies from these wars that are increasingly being used to just like police neighborhoods, and that, like I do find it very hard to imagine if there's like a Trump voter in somewhere like Minneapolis or something like that. I find it very, very hard that like in a situation like a massive overreach by the state, like what happened with ICE, that it's like even the most asshole prole wouldn't be like, okay, all right. Yeah. Even if they wouldn't call themselves a socialist, like I do feel like, they are at least in touch with their material circumstances enough to be like, yeah, I don't know about this,
Yeah. How long until somebody's like attempting to advocate for some kind of like MMT style job program, but purely in the arms industry, to tie everybody's material conditions to the necessity to build and then drop as many bombs as possible? Yeah.
I feel like that's constantly always happening. Still alive,
yeah. I mean, yeah, I guess it's the pork barrel politics of the military industrial complex, I guess, but
yeah.
Hopefully I'm using my American political terminology somewhat correctly there.
Yeah, whatever. The blob. There's a piece of... I wonder to what extent there is a blob on these wars now, It's like, there's no way the ruling class is fully behind a war in Iran. There's no way there's like a foreign policy consensus that's like, and that's what we should be doing right now. Like, I don't know. Maybe there is. Maybe I'll be proven wrong. But it's like, I just feel like everything is just so... Like there's just no consensus among the ruling class of what's going to work and what the plan should be. And so whenever anyone in the ruling class tries something, loads of people are like, what? This affects my bottom line,
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Well,
I feel like my apocalypse meter's sort of starting to warm up again.
Oh no. The springs, the coils. Oh well. All right. Well, you know what? If you got to read some Lenin, I'd say read this.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a debate worth engaging with, if nothing else. I'd say that.
Yeah. I enjoyed I very much enjoyed the fervor of it. I was convinced.
It's just an exciting time.
I'm on board with Mr. Lenin.
Yeah. An exciting time. Just like, back when, you could be a professional revolutionary. Like, Jesus.
All right. One day, Jack.
We'll be back with State and Revolution next time, I suppose. We'll finally get to that.
All right, yeah. Bye-bye.
All right, see you. Hey everybody, Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.